The evening started without any hint that it would veer into dangerous territory. The studio's atmosphere had the easy rhythm of routine, lights positioned perfectly, sound checks completed, and the crew exchanging nods as the countdown began. The panel was meant to focus on issues of ethics and influence in politics, a subject Ivanka Trump had faced before. She appeared serene in her seat, hands folded neatly on the table, that carefully cultivated poise she always carried when under public scrutiny. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett sat relaxed, leaning slightly back in her chair, giving the impression of someone who had all the time in the world. Donald Trump's name was, of course, threaded into the discussion from the start, his political legacy, his influence over family members, and his continued presence in the public sphere despite the swirl of controversies surrounding him. The moderator opened the conversation in neutral territory, inviting each guest to comment on the line between personal life and public service. Ivanka, with her practiced tone, spoke of the importance of family unity and how loyalty could coexist with ethical leadership. She referenced her father, calling him a man of vision and uncompromising commitment, and subtly shifted the discussion to portray her family as a model of resilience. She smiled easily while speaking, brushing aside the idea that personal matters could ever cloud political judgment. Her words were polished, almost rehearsed, and the audience responded with polite applause. Jasmine's turn came, and she began with a general observation about how political families often live in a bubble, shielded from the kind of accountability regular citizens face. Her voice was even, her delivery calm, but there was something in her phrasing that suggested she was steering the conversation towards something sharper. Donald Trump's name came up again, but this time, not in the light Ivanka had cast moments earlier. Jasmine noted how his presence in any setting seemed to bend the rules of the room, how loyalty to him sometimes became a shield against uncomfortable truths. The remark wasn't confrontational, but it carried a weight that made Ivanka glance over, a faint tightening around her eyes. Then came the moment that shifted the entire energy. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't break into accusations. She simply leaned forward slightly, meeting Ivanka's gaze with quiet steadiness, and said, "Sometimes, the scandals that matter most aren't about policy at all, they're about what happens behind closed doors, even in families." There was no mistaking who she was addressing. For the first time, Ivanka's stillness wasn't composed, it was rigid, as though she'd braced herself. The audience seemed to pick up on it immediately, the murmur of shuffling feet and shifting chairs breaking the smooth hum of the studio. The moderator, sensing the tension, tried to redirect the conversation, but Jasmine didn't let go. She didn't name every detail yet, but she positioned her words in such a way that everyone understood the direction she was going. "Ivanka, if we're going to talk about ethics," Jasmine continued evenly, "shouldn't we also be honest about personal relationships, even the ones involving your father?" There was a beat of silence. The sentence seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the bright studio lights overhead. Ivanka's mouth curved into a small smile, the kind used to dismiss something without engaging, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's ridiculous," she said, voice still light but edged with something sharper. Yet Jasmine didn't flinch. She began to reference specific years, certain locations, and the timelines of Donald Trump's public appearances that overlapped with private gatherings, weaving the hints together without yet stating them outright. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sensationalized. But the precision was deliberate. That was when the shift became undeniable. Ivanka's responses grew a shade quicker, overlapping Jasmine's sentences, attempting to shut down the narrative before it could root itself. Her body angled slightly toward the moderator rather than Jasmine, as if turning away might help diminish the weight of what had been implied. But the audience, both in the studio and at home, had already caught it, the subtle recoil, the quickening cadence, the controlled smile now struggling to hold. What had started as a smooth, typical panel discussion was no longer about general ethics. It had become a moment where the tension between what was said and what was left unsaid told its own story. Donald Trump's name lingered uncomfortably in the air, now tied not to leadership or vision, but to something Ivanka clearly wished had never been spoken aloud. The suddenness of the shift caught everyone, even the host, off guard, and it was in that unplanned turn that the night began to spiral towards something unforgettable. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. That was the striking thing about the way she spoke. Her pace was steady, deliberate, the sort of delivery that made people listen without realizing they were leaning in. After the moderator's attempt to smooth over the tension, she simply waited, letting the quiet stretch for a moment before continuing. Her eyes didn't leave Ivanka, and her tone never rose above conversational. It was as if she were discussing an uncomfortable but undeniable truth that everyone had been pretending not to see. She began threading details into the conversation like a seamstress pulling an invisible stitch. There were no wild accusations, no dramatic pauses designed for effect. Instead, she brought up small, specific moments in the past where Donald Trump's public calendar and Ivanka's private appearances seemed to blur in curious ways. She spoke of exclusive gatherings in Manhattan penthouses, unannounced visits to private estates in Florida, and late-night events that didn't match any public itinerary. The way she laid them out made it hard to dismiss them as coincidence. Ivanka tried to interject, her voice calm but with a noticeable urgency behind it, saying the allegations were absurd, unfounded, and politically motivated. But Jasmine's delivery was different from the typical on-air confrontation. She didn't argue. She didn't match Ivanka's interruptions with her own. She simply waited for the space to speak, then continued, each time returning to her points as if Ivanka's objections hadn't shifted her trajectory at all. It was in this measured pace that the weight of the words began to sink in. The allegations were not shouted in a frenzy but rather placed, one after another, like heavy stones. She mentioned the presence of certain close aides during these encounters, the way their statements over the years hinted at things they never fully explained. She even referenced a well-known charity gala where Donald Trump had arrived late, with Ivanka joining him at a side entrance, avoiding the main carpet entirely. The studio audience wasn't loud, but their silence was telling. Every time Jasmine added another detail, heads turned toward Ivanka, waiting for her to respond with something more concrete than dismissals. Instead, Ivanka's answers began to fray at the edges. She leaned forward in her chair, gesturing slightly more, her words spilling a bit faster than before. She accused Jasmine of using tabloid-style tactics, of dragging her father's name into baseless gossip to distract from real political issues. Jasmine's response was as simple: these aren't tabloid stories, they're facts people have chosen not to say out loud. Her voice stayed level, but there was a firmness in it that suggested she wasn't speculating, she was stating something she believed to be undeniable. She didn't linger on salacious language, nor did she raise her tone to match the tension in the room. Instead, she repeated the pattern, a date, a location, a circumstance, all linked by the presence of Donald Trump and Ivanka in ways that now seemed difficult to explain away. The more Jasmine spoke, the more it became clear that she was controlling the rhythm of the conversation. Ivanka's attempts to wrestle it back fell flat because they were reactive, while Jasmine remained consistent and composed. Even when Ivanka brought up her father's achievements, his business empire, and his political victories, Jasmine didn't take the bait to debate those points. She returned instead to her quiet, factual thread, the one that kept circling back to the same uncomfortable implication. For the viewers at home, the scene was unnerving precisely because it lacked the chaos usually associated with scandal. Donald Trump's name wasn't being hurled as a weapon, it was being placed into a context where the pieces fit too neatly for comfort. The restraint in Jasmine's voice made her words linger longer in the mind, creating a sense that this wasn't performance, it was revelation. By the time the moderator tried again to shift the focus to broader issues, it was too late. The conversation had already narrowed into a laser point aimed directly at Ivanka and, by extension, her father. The political talking points, the smiling deflections, the references to family loyalty, none of them seemed to stick. Jasmine's calm persistence had built a wall around the moment, one that even Ivanka's most polished answers couldn't break through. The allegations now hung in the air like an unspoken truth everyone was waiting for anyone, to either confirm or deny outright. The first signs of strain in Ivanka's composure were almost imperceptible. To most casual viewers, she still looked composed, her posture straight, her hair perfectly arranged, her voice maintaining that familiar measured tone. But those paying close attention noticed the subtle changes. Her eyes shifted more frequently, glancing toward the moderator instead of directly at Jasmine. Her hands, which had been resting gracefully on the table earlier, began to clasp and unclasp in small, controlled movements. These weren't the gestures of someone relaxed, they were the quiet signals of someone feeling cornered. As Jasmine continued, Ivanka's interruptions became more frequent. At first, they were polite, "That's not accurate," or "Let's not twist the facts." But slowly, the polish began to wear. She started speaking over Jasmine before she could finish a sentence, her tone inching higher, her phrasing slightly sharper. It was the kind of defensiveness that suggested more than annoyance. It hinted at concern. Donald Trump's name, once a symbol of strength in Ivanka's public narrative, now seemed to weigh heavier every time it was mentioned. In her earlier remarks, she had been comfortable linking herself to his legacy, speaking warmly about his influence and vision. But in this moment, the association felt dangerous. Every time Jasmine connected him to the timelines and events she described, Ivanka's responses became more clipped, as if she were trying to sever the link before it could be fully formed in the minds of the audience. The camera angles didn't help her. Each time she interrupted or turned her gaze away, the live broadcast caught it, small shifts in expression, a tighter set to her jaw. On social media, viewers began screen-grabbing those moments in real time, pairing them with captions that speculated on what she might be hiding. Even without shouting or accusations, the visual story was telling its own version of events. At one point, Ivanka attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground by invoking her father's accomplishments. She spoke about his business empire, his rise in politics, and how his work ethic had shaped her own career. But instead of moving the focus away, it provided Jasmine another opening. And yet, Jasmine replied evenly, "For someone so committed to public service, you've been at his side in some very private situations that never seemed to fit the public story." The words weren't loud, but they landed with precision. That was when Ivanka's voice changed. It wasn't an outright loss of control, but there was a noticeable shift, a slight edge, the rhythm of someone speaking faster than usual in an effort to get ahead of the narrative. She accused Jasmine of inventing connections, of using innuendo to smear both her and her father. But the more she tried to dismantle the statements, the more she seemed to confirm that they had struck a nerve. Jasmine, for her part, remained calm. She didn't react to the interruptions with visible frustration. Instead, she kept her focus, maintaining eye contact in a way that left Ivanka visibly uncomfortable. She returned to her slow, deliberate style, placing her points on the table one by one, never raising her tone. The imbalance between Ivanka's growing agitation and Jasmine's composure made the contrast all the more striking. The tension became almost tangible in the studio. The audience wasn't shifting in their seats anymore, they were still, watching closely. The moderator glanced between the two women, clearly aware that the interview had left the realm of general discussion and entered far more personal, volatile territory. Every mention of Donald Trump now seemed to carry a double meaning, one tied not just to politics, but to something Ivanka clearly wanted to keep buried. By the time the segment was nearing its end, Ivanka's demeanor had shifted entirely from the serene presence she displayed at the beginning. Her smile had disappeared, replaced with the kind of tightened expression that comes from holding back sharper words. The camera caught her taking a slow breath before answering one final question, her eyes fixed on the desk rather than on Jasmine. The change wasn't dramatic enough to be called an outburst, but it was undeniable. The cracks in her composure were no longer hidden, and the weight of her father's name had turned from an asset into a liability in real time. When the cameras cut away for a commercial break, the studio's tension didn't dissolve, it thickened. People on set later said you could feel it, an almost physical shift in the air. Ivanka stood quickly, smoothing her dress with one hand while keeping her gaze away from Jasmine. She walked toward the edge of the set, speaking in a low, urgent tone to one of the producers. Her lips moved quickly, but her expression remained tight, the kind of controlled look someone wears when they're trying not to let frustration spill over in public. Donald Trump's name was still ringing in everyone's mind, and not because of his business ventures or political wins. The connection Jasmine had made now lived in the whispers being traded quietly among crew members. Jasmine, in contrast, stayed in her seat, unhurried, sipping from a small water bottle. She didn't engage in side conversations, didn't gloat, didn't look like someone who had just delivered a blow. And maybe that was part of what made the whole exchange so unsettling. The lack of performance made her words feel heavier, as if they had been rooted in certainty rather than in an attempt to provoke. For those who had been in television long enough to recognize real discomfort, Ivanka's pacing at the side of the set was telling. Behind the scenes, some of the crew were checking their phones. Social media was already flooded with short clips from the live broadcast, the hashtags combining Ivanka's name with her father's in ways that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The snippets focused on the moments where she interrupted Jasmine, the slight edge in her voice, and the fleeting looks of discomfort when Donald Trump was mentioned in certain contexts. Even without the full conversation, those few seconds were enough to ignite speculation. When the show returned from break, Ivanka had resumed her seat, but the ease she displayed earlier was gone. Her smile felt thinner, her voice a little more guarded. The moderator, clearly aware of the live reaction building online, steered the conversation to safer topics: economic policies, infrastructure, education. But the earlier exchange still hung over the set like a shadow. Every time Ivanka spoke, it was impossible not to recall the tension from before, the way her father's name had been tied to something she never wanted to address on air. Jasmine didn't bring it up again during the remainder of the program, and she didn't have to. The damage was already done. The silence on the subject now seemed louder than the confrontation itself. It was as if the absence of further comment confirmed that there was nothing to debate. The moment had spoken for itself. Donald Trump's role in the story no longer needed elaboration. The mere suggestion had been enough to make the audience connect the dots in their own minds. As soon as the credits rolled, Ivanka was on her feet again, this time moving quickly toward the exit. A few people called after her, but she didn't stop. She passed by crew members without acknowledging them, her steps sharp and measured. Outside the studio doors, a cluster of photographers had gathered, tipped off about the heated exchange. The questions they shouted weren't about politics or policy, they were about her father, about what Jasmine had said, and whether she intended to respond. Ivanka didn't answer. She kept walking, the sound of camera shutters chasing her down the sidewalk. Back inside, Jasmine lingered for a few minutes, chatting with the moderator and a couple of crew members. She didn't reference the confrontation directly, but her relaxed demeanor contrasted so starkly with Ivanka's departure that it became another talking point. The people in the studio, from interns to senior producers, understood they had just witnessed one of those moments that would be replayed and dissected for days, maybe weeks. By the time the evening news cycle picked it up, the clip had already been viewed millions of times online. Commentators debated whether Jasmine's comments had crossed a line or whether they were a justified challenge to someone in the public eye. But one thing was clear, the discussion was no longer about ethics in a broad sense. It was about Ivanka, her father, and the implications of what had been suggested on live television. The restraint Jasmine had shown during the segment made the story even more potent, because it hadn't been framed as a personal attack, it had been presented like a piece of information waiting for someone brave enough to say it. By the end of the night, the conversation had taken on a life far beyond the studio walls. What began as a standard panel discussion had morphed into a cultural flashpoint, the kind that blurred the line between politics, media, and personal scandal. The heart of the story wasn't in the shouting matches or sensational theatrics, there hadn't been any. It was in the precision of Jasmine Crockett's words, the way she had delivered them without haste, and the visible effect they had on Ivanka Trump in real time. Donald Trump's name, so often wielded by his family as a symbol of power and legacy, had been recontextualized in front of millions. For years, Ivanka had leaned on her father's public persona to bolster her own image, speaking proudly of their shared values and accomplishments. But now, in the wake of Jasmine's remarks, that name carried a new and uninvited weight. It was no longer just a political brand, it was tied to an implication she clearly wanted to avoid. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Within hours, social media platforms overflowed with clips, slowed-down moments, and side-by-side comparisons of Ivanka's demeanor before and after the confrontation. The internet thrives on contrast, and here was a perfect one: the cool, composed Ivanka from the start of the broadcast versus the guarded, defensive Ivanka struggling to contain the shift in tone. Every raised eyebrow, every tightened jawline became fodder for speculation. Mainstream news outlets followed suit. Morning shows played the clip repeatedly, some hosts dissecting Jasmine's delivery as a masterclass in controlled confrontation, others questioning whether such personal matters had any place in political discourse. Yet, regardless of the opinion being voiced, one fact was unavoidable: the story had overtaken the intended subject of the program. What had been meant as a discussion on ethics and politics had now become an ethics question of its own, centered entirely on Ivanka and her father. For Ivanka, the fallout wasn't just about one night on television. It was about the erosion of control over her own narrative. Public figures carefully curate their images, and she had been one of the most adept at doing so until that moment. Jasmine hadn't dismantled Ivanka's brand with volume or chaos, she had done it with a steady hand, planting seeds that the public was now eager to water with speculation and memory. Behind closed doors, political strategists and PR teams were likely drafting responses, weighing whether to confront the story directly or starve it of oxygen. But in an age where attention moves like wildfire, silence can sometimes burn just as quickly as words. Donald Trump himself had not yet commented, but his silence, too, was becoming part of the conversation. In the end, the moment's impact was not in what was proven, but in what was made plausible. Jasmine had shifted the audience's perception without needing to convince them outright, she had only needed to make them look at Ivanka differently. And once people see something in a new light, it's nearly impossible to unsee it. The lasting impression was that of a crack in an otherwise polished facade, one that no amount of post-show spin